At Grandpa's will reading, my sister Sophie smiled the second the lawyer mentioned $20 million. She leaned close enough that only I could hear her. Looks like Grandpa knew which granddaughter mattered. My mother squeezed her hand. My father actually said, he made the right choice. I didn't argue. I was 38 years old. I had a career, my own home outside Boston, retirement savings, and enough money in the bank that nobody in that room paid a single bill for me. I didn't need Grandpa's $20 million. But apparently, some part of me still cared whether my family thought I mattered. Then the lawyer lifted one hand. Before anyone celebrates, he said, I need to finish explaining the structure of Mr. Hart's estate. Sophie's smile tightened. A few minutes later, he opened a sealed letter Grandpa had left as guidance for the Independent Foundation Board. The first sentence was enough to make my sister stop smiling. If Sophie believes the $20 million belongs to her, then she has misunderstood both my will and me. The room went still. Then the lawyer read the next paragraph. Grandpa wanted the board to verify the origins of the scholarship model Sophie had spent years presenting as proof of her leadership. I looked at my sister. For the first time that morning, she wasn't looking at me. She was looking at our father. The law office sat on the third floor of an old brick building in Fairfield County, Connecticut, the kind of place where the wood paneling looked older than some corporations. Grandpa would have liked it. He distrusted offices with glass walls. Said people behaved better when there was solid wood around them. I had arrived 20 minutes early because that was what I did when I was anxious. Sophie arrived 11 minutes late and somehow made lateness look intentional. She came through the door in a cream coat, hugged my mother, kissed my father on the cheek, and apologized to no one. Mom immediately said, "Traffic from Greenwich is impossible." I had driven from Massachusetts. No one asked about my traffic. That difference was so ordinary, I almost didn't notice it anymore. Almost. The lawyer, Mr. Calder, waited until everyone had settled before beginning. There were 9 of us around the conference table, though only 4 people in the room seemed emotionally invested in where Grandpa's money went. Sophie, my parents, and me, according to everyone else. That was the funny part. They had spent years telling people I was obsessed with fairness. What they meant was that I noticed when the rules changed depending on which daughter was standing in the room. Mr. Calder read through several ordinary bequests first. Furniture, personal effects, a modest amount to a historical society Grandpa supported. Then he reached the charitable portion. Mr. Hart directed approximately $20 million in investment assets to the Hart Education Foundation. Sophie inhaled sharply. Mom touched her arm. Dad gave her the look he used when one of us had done something that made him proud. I knew that look. Mostly because I had spent the first 25 years of my life trying to earn it. Mr. Calder continued. The foundation is governed separately from the estate under its own organizing documents and bylaws. Sophie was still smiling. Mr. Hart nominated his granddaughter, Sophie Hart, to serve as the initial family representative. Mom whispered, "Oh, sweetheart." Sophie turned toward me. That was when she said it. Looks like Grandpa knew which granddaughter mattered. There are insults that hurt because they are cruel, and then there are insults that hurt because they fit perfectly into a story you spent years pretending you no longer believed. My fingers tightened around the edge of the legal pad in front of me. For half a second, I was 16 again, standing in our kitchen while Dad told relatives Sophie had a natural gift with people, and I was better behind the scenes. Then I was 38 again. Director of Grant Compliance. Mortgage paid on time. Emergency fund intact. No parental checks arriving in my mailbox. I loosened my fingers. Dad smiled at Sophie. He made the right choice. Mr. Calder looked up. I haven't finished. Dad's expression changed slightly. Not much. Just enough. Mr. Calder tapped the document in front of him. Miss Hart's nomination is subject to confirmation by the independent board under the foundation's bylaws. Sophie frowned. Confirmation? Dr. Miriam Cole, who had introduced herself before the reading as chair of the foundation's independent board, sat 2 seats away from me. She had said very little so far. Now she folded her hands. Mr. Hart designed the structure so no family member automatically controls charitable assets. Sophie gave a small laugh. I understand that, obviously. I wasn't sure she had understood it 30 seconds earlier. I kept that thought to myself. Mr. Calder continued explaining. The $20 million belonged to the foundation. Not Sophie, not me, not my parents. The money could be used only for the foundation's charitable purposes and managed under its governing documents. Sophie's nomination gave her the possibility of a voice. Not ownership. That distinction mattered, at least to people who read what they were signing. Mr. Calder then reached for a cream envelope resting beside his folder. "This is not an amendment to the will," he said. "It does not alter the legal terms I just described." His wording was careful. I appreciated that. "It is a letter of guidance Mr. Hart asked to be read after the relevant provisions of his estate plan." My mother shifted beside Sophie. Dad leaned back. Mr. Calder broke the seal. The paper made a small tearing sound. I remember that sound better than I remember most of what was said before it. Then he read Grandpa's first sentence. "If Sophie believes the $20 million belongs to her, then she has misunderstood both my will and me." Nobody moved. Sophie's cheeks changed color. Dad stared at the table. Mom blinked once. Hard. I felt something inside me lift its head. Not triumph. Not yet. Recognition. Mr. Calder kept reading. Grandpa wrote that the foundation had been created to serve students, not family prestige. He expressed concern that certain scholarship concepts being attributed publicly to one family member might have originated elsewhere. He did not accuse Sophie of theft. He did not say she had lied. He did not say I had created anything. That mattered too. What he did say was that before the board used any family member's claimed charitable work as evidence of leadership or suitability, it should verify the origin of the scholarship framework and the source of the outcomes being cited. Then came one line I had to hear twice before I understood what it meant. Good intentions are not improved by inaccurate credit. My throat went dry. Years earlier, I had built a scholarship pilot at the university where I worked. At least, I had built it in the practical sense. I had helped structure the eligibility model, compliance rules, reporting process, retention measures, and review cycle as part of my job. The work belonged within the university's program, not to me personally. But I knew who had done that work. I knew who had spent nights fixing the framework after our first round of reviewer comments. I knew who had argued that first-year GPA alone was a weak measure for students juggling jobs, family responsibilities, and financial instability. Me. And I knew Sophie had later launched a family charity initiative that looked strangely familiar. At the time, I had told myself that similarity didn't matter. More students might get help. Wasn't that the point? That was the line I had used to swallow the discomfort. For years. Mr. Calder finished the letter. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then, Sophie cleared her throat. "Well?" She smiled again, but this one looked dissembled. "Grandpa always worried about paperwork." I looked at her. She turned to Dr. Cole instead. "I assume the board understands what he meant." Dr. Cole's expression didn't change. "The board will understand what the records support." That was all she said. My father stood. "We're not turning Arthur's final wishes into some kind of audit circus." Mr. Calder closed the folder. "No one has suggested that." But Dad was already irritated. That was another old family pattern. He often answered accusations nobody had made. We made it as far as the hallway before Sophie stopped beside a framed watercolor and turned on me. "Please don't do this." I blinked. "Do what?" "You know exactly what." "No, actually, I don't." Mom caught up behind her. "Evelyn." She said my name in the tone she had used when I was a teenager and needed to be reminded that peace in our family was mostly my responsibility. "Grandpa has been gone 3 weeks. This is not the time to start competing with your sister." I looked at her. "I haven't asked for anything." Sophie crossed her arms. "You don't have to. Your face says enough." I almost laughed. My face. Of course. Dad joined us. "Your grandfather was cautious near the end. He questioned everything." I thought about correcting the implication. Instead, I asked, "If the nomination is automatic, why does the board need to confirm Sophie?" Dad's jaw tightened. "I didn't say it was automatic." "Then why did you just tell her he made the right choice before the lawyer finished reading?" Silence. Small, but real. Sophie stepped in before Dad answered. "Fine. There's a board. There are formalities. Nobody cares about that part. I do. She rolled her eyes. Of course you do. There it was. The old dismissal. Evelyn cares about paperwork. Evelyn notices technicalities. Evelyn makes simple things difficult. I felt my shoulders start to pull inward, a physical habit older than my career. Then Sophie changed subjects so smoothly it took me a second to realize what she was doing. The foundation is going to need grant policies, immediately. I stared at her. What? Grant criteria, reporting, conflict stuff, whatever you call it. Conflict of interest policies? See? This is why we need you. Dad nodded as if the matter had been settled. It makes sense. Mom smiled. You two could finally work together. I looked from one face to the next. 5 minutes earlier, Grandpa's letter had questioned the origin of Sophie's scholarship work. Now my family wanted me to build the compliance structure that would make her look capable of running the foundation. The pattern was almost elegant. Sophie got the title. I got the work. And if I objected, I was jealous. I'll send you what we need, Sophie said. I opened my mouth. The old Evelyn would have said, sure. Then, gone home, and spent the weekend researching foundation grant controls. Instead I said, send me exactly what you want in writing. Sophie blinked. Why? So, I know what you're asking me to do. It's family. That doesn't answer the question. Dad exhaled loudly. There you go again. I looked at him. Going where? Making everything transactional. That word landed harder than it should have. Transactional. My family loved that word whenever I asked what my work was worth. I looked at the elevator doors. I have a train of thought I'd like to keep, I said. Send it in writing. Then I walked away before anyone gave me permission. My condo outside Boston was 1,200 square feet and completely unimpressive. I loved it. The cabinets were the color I picked. The mortgage was in my name. The framed print in the hallway hung slightly crooked because I had never cared enough to fix it. Nobody could threaten to take the place away because I asked the wrong question at dinner. That night I set my overnight bag by the washing machine and opened my banking app. Not because I was worried. Because I needed to remind myself of something. My emergency fund was healthy. My retirement contributions were automatic. My mortgage payment had cleared 3 days earlier. Grandpa's estate could distribute $20 million or $20 and my life would still function Monday morning. I closed the app. That should have made Sophie's comment meaningless. It didn't. Looks like Grandpa knew which granddaughter mattered. I stood in my kitchen with one hand on the counter. The strange thing about becoming independent was discovering that old wounds did not automatically disappear when the financial dependence did. Sometimes all independence gave you was enough room to finally look at them. My phone buzzed. Sophie. I let it ring. That was small. Ridiculously small. But in my family, not answering immediately was a form of rebellion. I made tea instead. Monday morning. The university library windows were pale with winter light when I opened a grant file and noticed the wrong version attached to a compliance review. The document itself was almost identical to the correct one. Almost. The footer had an outdated date. One reporting threshold hadn't been updated. A colleague had attached draft 4 instead of final 5. I corrected it before the file moved forward. You catch everything, my colleague said. Not everything. Enough to make the rest of us nervous. She smiled. I did too. My family called the same habit obsessive. At work, they called it useful. I looked back at the corrected document. One phrase in the final version caught my eye. Retention beyond first year. My hand stopped on the mouse. I had used almost the same wording years ago. Not there. In the scholarship pilot. By lunch, I was in the older part of the university library with a cardboard archive box I had kept from that project. Nothing classified. Nothing containing student records. Mostly printed drafts, public reports, my own notes, and copies I was allowed to retain from work I had participated in. Near the bottom was the proposal. Janet Morales's handwriting filled the margins. Too broad. Define persistence. What happens after year 1? I smiled despite myself. Janet had been merciless. She had also made the program better. My phone vibrated. An email from Dad. Subject. Foundation setup. I opened it. There was a list. Grant rubric. Reporting framework. Conflict disclosures. Evaluation standards. No title. No contract. No scope of authority. No compensation. Under Dad's message was a forwarded note from Sophie. You already built the framework once. Just update it and put the foundation logo on it. I read the sentence twice. Then a third time. Not because I was shocked. Because words mattered. You already built the framework once. Sophie had spent years describing the Hart Scholarship model as something she developed. But here she was, casually acknowledging that I had built a framework before. That did not prove she had lied. It did not prove she had copied anything. It proved only what it said. So I treated it the way I treated any statement in a compliance file. I saved the email. Then I asked a narrower question. When had Dad first seen my original framework? I searched my personal email archive. 8 years back. His name. Scholarship. Sample. There. Dad's message was short. Evelyn. Sophie wants to start something charitable. Send me one of your sample frameworks. You're good at this stuff. I remembered smiling when I got it. I had been proud, he asked. I had sent the file that night. The attachment name sat on the screen. First Gen. Retention. Framework. V3. My pulse slowed instead of quickening. That was what happened when something hurt enough to become clear. I created a read-only copy of the email and wrote down the date. Then I checked the sent line. Richard Hart. Only Richard Hart. Not Sophie. Not Grandpa. Dad. My phone rang before I could think further. Dr. Miriam Cole. I answered. Evelyn Hart. Miss Hart? This is Miriam Cole. Is this a bad time? No. I wanted to clarify something after Friday. I sat straighter. The founder's letter. Yes, I don't want there to be confusion. The letter does not change the will or the foundation bylaws. I understood that. Good. Your grandfather expressed a concern. The board has authority under the existing governance documents to evaluate nominees. If you believe there is a provenance issue relevant to that evaluation, we would need records, not family recollections. I looked at Dad's email. That sounds reasonable. And no one expects you to build the foundation's compliance system while this is being reviewed. I almost laughed. My family does. There was a short silence. Then Miriam said, that is not a board requirement. 4 words. Not a board requirement. Meaning I did not have to rescue anyone. Not Sophie. Not Dad. Not Grandpa's legacy. I thanked Miriam and ended the call. Then I opened Dad's foundation email and hit reply all. For years, I had believed being useful was the safest position in my family. Useful daughters got invited back. Useful daughters were difficult to discard completely. Useful daughters might not get thanked, but eventually somebody would realize what they had done. I knew better now. Or at least I was beginning to. I typed one sentence. I won't build the foundation's compliance system off the books. If professional support is needed, send me a written scope, authority structure, and terms. I read it twice. My hand hovered over send. Some old part of me whispered that Dad would call me selfish. Mom would say I was punishing Sophie. Sophie would say I was jealous. For once, I let them have the future versions of me they had already written. Then I pressed send. 37 seconds later, Dad replied. Unbelievable. Everything has to be about money with you. I stared at the message. Then I looked at the 8-year-old email beneath it. You're good at this stuff. Send me one of your sample frameworks. Same father. Same work. Different story depending on who needed something from me. I put the 2 emails side by side. And for the first time, I stopped asking whether Sophie had copied me. I started asking who had decided my work was hers to use. Dad did not call me again that Monday. That was how I knew my email had landed harder than an argument would have. Usually, when Richard Hart thought one of his daughters was being unreasonable, he preferred the phone. A call gave him room to interrupt, sigh, change the subject, or end with some version of, "We'll talk when you've calmed down." Writing took those options away. So by Tuesday afternoon, my inbox contained nothing from him except the original thread with his single-word verdict. Unbelievable. Mom took a different approach. Her text arrived while I was leaving a compliance meeting. Lunch Saturday. Just us. We need to clear the air before this goes any further. The elevator doors opened. 3 people stepped around me while I stood staring at the screen. Just us, in my mother's vocabulary, had never meant just her and me. It meant everyone she believed should have a vote in whatever boundary I was trying to establish. My thumb hovered over the keyboard. The easy answer was no. The more useful answer was yes. Not because I thought lunch would heal anything. Because Sophie had already made one statement that did not fit the story she had told for years. You already built the framework once. If she wanted to keep talking, I wanted to hear what version came next. Saturday at noon, I parked outside the restaurant Mom had chosen in Westport. She had reserved a table in the back corner, away from the windows. Dad was already there. So was Sophie, of course. Mom rose halfway when I approached. I'm glad you came. Sophie did not stand. A mimosa sat in front of her beside a leather folder with the Heart Education Foundation logo embossed across the front. The logo bothered me more than it should have. The board had not even confirmed her role yet. Still, she had stationery. Dad looked at his watch. Traffic? No. That answer left him nowhere to go. I took the empty chair. Mom smiled too brightly. Can we please have one meal where nobody turns everything into a deposition? I haven't asked anyone a question yet. Dad's mouth flattened. That tone is exactly what I mean. The server arrived before I could answer. For a few minutes we became four ordinary people discussing coffee, eggs, and whether anyone wanted toast. Then Sophie opened the leather folder. I brought some preliminary materials. A printed page slid toward me. At the top, under the foundation logo, was a proposed scholarship description. The first paragraph used language broad enough to be meaningless. The second was more specific. Persistence. First-generation students. Retention beyond the first academic year. My fork stopped halfway to my plate. There it was again. Not proof. A phrase. A familiar structure. Sophie tapped the page. We could use your help tightening this. Who wrote it? Her expression changed by less than an inch. Why does that matter? Because you're asking me to revise it. I drafted most of it. Most? Dad put down his coffee. Evelyn. My eyes stayed on the page. When did you start developing this model? Sophie leaned back. You're really doing this? Doing what? Cross-examining me over brunch. I asked when you developed it. Mom touched the stem of her water glass. Honey, maybe don't make this so adversarial. I looked at Sophie. She gave a small shrug. Years ago. That's not a date. Fine. Early spring, March maybe. Something inside me became very still. The email from Dad asking for my sample framework had been sent in May. Which year? Sophie named the same year. Dad exhaled through his nose. This is ridiculous. Maybe. But dates did not become less real because my father disliked them. Sophie picked up her mimosa. Grandpa encouraged me from the beginning. You know that. Actually, I did not. I knew Grandpa attended events. I knew he donated. I knew he praised Sophie publicly. I did not know when she first presented the concept to him, because I had not been there. So, I said nothing. That silence seemed to irritate her more than an accusation would have. She leaned forward. You know what? I'm trying to be generous here. With what? Credit. The word hung between us. Mom's eyes moved to me. Sophie continued. I'm willing to make sure people understand you helped with some of the technical side. I've never had a problem saying you're good at that. Helped. Technical side. The words were so familiar they might as well have been furniture. Dad nodded. Exactly. You made a framework. Sophie made people care. There it was. Not denial. Hierarchy. One daughter created something boring. The other transformed it into something valuable. Years ago, I would have started explaining. I would have listed meetings and revisions and reports until everyone looked exhausted enough to confirm what they already believed about me. Instead, I folded the printed page once, then opened it again. When did you first use the retention metric? Sophie stared at me. Dad said, Enough. That one word used to work beautifully. It had ended debates about money, holidays, caregiving, birthdays, and every occasion when fairness became inconvenient. This time, I set the page back on the table. I'm asking because the date matters. To you, Sophie said. Yes. She laughed once. Of course it does. Lunch ended 20 minutes later. Nobody yelled. Nobody cried. Mom paid the check before I could offer. On the way out, she caught my arm near the hostess stand. Your sister is trying to include you. I looked down at her hand until she let go. She offered to share credit for something she says she created. That isn't what she meant. Then she can write down what she means. Mom's face tightened. You are making this so much harder than it has to be. The old answer rose automatically. Sorry. It almost reached my mouth. Instead, I said, hard for who? Her expression changed. Not dramatically. Just enough that I knew the question had landed. I left before she answered. By Sunday morning, my dining table was covered with dates. Not confidential files. Not student information. Nothing I would have been embarrassed to explain to University Council. That distinction mattered. The scholarship pilot had been developed as part of my university work. The materials were not some private invention I could carry away and claim as personal intellectual property. That was not my argument. The university could own every formal program document, and my question would remain the same. Who had done the work? What existed when? What had Sophie represented to the foundation board as her own history? Those were provenance questions, not ownership. I wrote the distinction across the top of a yellow legal pad. Provenance, not copyright. Then I built the timeline, using only material I could properly rely on. In January, the framework draft existed. In February, Janet Morales reviewed the program structure with me. In March, we revised eligibility and persistence measures after internal feedback. In May, Dad asked for a sample framework. In July, the earliest Heart charity brochure I had saved publicly described a model that looked remarkably familiar. Nothing on that page proved copying. Similarity could come from common practice. Words like access, persistence, and retention belonged to an entire field. That was exactly why I refused to overstate what I had. A weak argument dressed as certainty was still a weak argument. The more interesting question sat in the February review. Janet. Her name had been in the margins from the beginning. She had worked in university program development before retiring, and Grandpa had known her socially through several education events. For the first time, a possibility I did not like formed cleanly enough to examine. Maybe Dad had not been the first bridge. Maybe Janet had talked to Grandpa. Maybe Grandpa had repeated something to Sophie. The thought embarrassed me almost immediately. Not because it was impossible, because part of me had reached for an outsider before allowing myself to suspect my father. Monday afternoon, I called Janet. She answered on the fourth ring. Evelyn Hart, either you've won an award or something has gone terribly wrong. Despite myself, I smiled. Those are the only reasons I call? At your age? Mostly. Her voice had not changed much. Dry, warm around the edges. We spent a minute on harmless things before I asked if she remembered the first-generation scholarship pilot. Oh, I remember that monster. That bad? You gave me 42 pages when 12 would have done. I was younger. You're still you. That almost made me laugh. Then I asked the real question. Did you ever share the framework with my grandfather? Janet went quiet. Not suspiciously. Thinking. I talked to Arthur about student retention once or twice. Maybe at a donor dinner. Did you send him the proposal? No. Any draft? No. What about Sophie? I knew she was running some charity project. I told your grandfather it was good the family was putting money toward education. My fingers tightened around the pen. Did you see her materials? Not that I remember. You're sure? No, Janet said. The directness stopped me. I'm sure I didn't send your proposal. I'm not going to tell you I remember every brochure I saw at a dinner 8 years ago. Fair. That was why I had trusted her professionally. She never inflated memory into evidence. There were comments you sent me, I said. Do you still have that email chain? Possibly. If you do, I only need the date, recipients, and whatever you can verify from your own records. Evelyn. Yes? What exactly are you trying to prove? My eyes moved to the yellow pad. Nothing yet. Another pause. Good answer, she said. The email arrived that evening. Janet had found the correspondence. Her original review message was addressed to me alone. New Grandpa. New Dad. No Sophie. The attachment matched the printed version I still had. including the comment about defining persistence beyond the first year. For several minutes, I stared at the recipient line. Janet had not handed my framework to the hearts, at least not through any channel her records supported. The red arrow on my timeline went back to May. Me to Dad. Dad to blank. The blank irritated me, not because I needed it filled immediately, because my entire childhood had trained me to fill blanks in my parents' favor. Dad probably forgot. Dad was simplifying. Dad thought Sophie needed it more. Dad did not understand how much it mattered. There was always a charitable explanation available if I worked hard enough. My phone lit up before I could continue. Sophie, this time, I answered. Hi. Can we talk without you taking notes? I glanced at the pen in my hand. I'm listening. That isn't what I asked. Then ask something else. A breath came through the speaker. I'm trying to fix this. What is this? The mess Grandpa created. He created a foundation. You know what I mean? No, I did not. Not enough to say I did. She continued. The board wants everything documented now. Fine. Whatever. You're better at that stuff than I am. That was the second time she had admitted it without noticing. Okay. We could work together. What would that mean? You handle the compliance side for a few months. I handle donors and strategy. Once everything settles, I'll make sure people understand how much you helped. The kitchen clock ticked behind me. Years earlier, that offer might have felt like progress. A place near the table. A little credit. A promise that after I did enough work, someone would eventually point toward me. Now all I could hear was the sequence. Sophie got the role first. My authority came later. Maybe. My name came later. Maybe. Compensation had not been mentioned at all. Send me a scope, I said. She groaned. Evelyn. And the reporting structure. You cannot be serious. Authority too. If you want me responsible for compliance, I need to know who can override a decision. This is exactly what Dad means. About what? You make everything sound like a corporate negotiation. You're asking for professional work. For Grandpa's foundation? Yes. For students? Yes. Then why are you talking about compensation? There was the trap. Good people did not ask what their labor cost. Good sisters did not ask who got authority. If the mission sounded noble enough, apparently, I was supposed to stop being a professional. My free hand rested against the edge of the counter. If the foundation needs professional work, it can treat it professionally. Silence. Then Sophie said, You're jealous. The words came out almost gently. That made them more familiar. Of what? You know. No, tell me. Grandpa chose me. The board hasn't confirmed you. Her voice sharpened. He nominated me. Yes. And you cannot stand it. Maybe a small part of me could not. That was the uncomfortable truth. Hearing Grandpa name Sophie had hurt. But hurt did not change dates. Jealousy did not rewrite emails. I'm not asking the board to give me your seat, I said. Not yet. I don't want your seat. You expect me to believe that? That's up to you. Another long breath. Then I asked the question I had been carrying since Saturday. Did Dad give you the framework I sent him? Nothing came through the phone for 2 seconds. Then 3. When Sophie answered, her tone had changed. Why does it matter who emailed what 8 years ago? Not yes, not no. I let the answer remain exactly what it was. It matters because you're asking the board to evaluate your history with the program. That is such a twisted way to say this. What would be the untwisted way? You helped. I developed it. Dad supported me. Grandpa funded it. Everybody contributed. Then writing down the timeline should be easy. She hung up. The line went dead against my ear. For a moment, the kitchen felt too quiet. Then the relief arrived. Not because I had caught her. I hadn't. Not yet. The relief came from something smaller. I had asked the question without apologizing for asking it. Tuesday morning, Dr. Cole emailed me. The message was concise. If I intended to raise a provenance concern relevant to Sophie's nomination, the board needed a written chronology, supported by source records. Sophie would receive the substance of the concern and be given a chance to respond. No anonymous accusation. No secret ambush. No special treatment because Grandpa had put my family's name on the building. I respected that. It also frightened me. A private grievance could still be softened later. A written submission carried my name, my professional judgment, my willingness to say, on record, that the public story did not match the documents I had seen. The cursor blinked on a blank page. At the top, I typed, "What I can prove." Below it, "What I infer." Then, "What I cannot prove." 3 categories. 3 places where emotion did not get to decide what belonged. The first section filled slowly. The second stayed shorter. The third was longer than I wanted. That was fine. Truth did not become stronger because I was impatient with the missing pieces. Near 5 that evening, I opened an old Heart Charity brochure again. The public copy had been saved in my personal email because Mom had proudly sent it to the whole extended family years ago. A paragraph described the program's approach to student persistence. My eyes moved across the line once, then back. One phrase stood out. Not because it was sophisticated, because it was awkward. I remembered fighting to keep that exact wording in an internal evaluation draft before later simplifying it for public use. A sentence fragment nobody outside the project should have found especially memorable. Yet there it was, in Sophie's brochure. My hand stopped above the keyboard. Similarity was not proof. Memory was not proof. But the question had changed again. Someone hadn't just repeated the shape of my idea. Someone had carried my language into Sophie's story. The phrase from Sophie's brochure bothered me for 2 days. Not because it was elegant. It wasn't. That was the problem. The wording had always sounded slightly wrong to me, even when I wrote it. Support persistence beyond initial academic performance indicators. Too stiff. Too many nouns pretending to be a sentence. We eventually cleaned it up before the university published anything for students. The uglier version had lived only in an internal evaluation draft and in the notes I used while explaining the pilot to a handful of people. One of them had been my father. Memory alone was not enough. By Wednesday morning, a yellow legal pad sat beside my laptop with 3 words written across the top. Verify access first. The temptation to jump from familiar wording to certainty was exactly the kind of mistake I spent my professional life warning other people not to make. So I went backward. Not into confidential university files. Not into student records. Into my own calendar, old personal correspondence, and material that had already been published. 8 years earlier, there had been a dinner with Dad after work. My calendar still showed it. Dad Boston scholarship numbers. Seeing the entry brought back the restaurant before it brought back the conversation. A narrow place near Back Bay. Dark green booths. Dad complaining that the portions were too small. A paper copy of my evaluation draft folded inside my tote bag because I had come straight from the office. He had asked how I knew the pilot was working. I remembered turning the pages toward him, but remembering that did not prove what he had seen. The useful part came 10 minutes later. An email from Dad the following morning. Those retention numbers are impressive. Sophie could use something concrete like that when she talks to donors. My hands stayed still over the keyboard. There it was. Not proof that he copied a document. Not proof that he gave Sophie the wording. Proof that he had seen the metrics. Proof that he had connected those metrics to Sophie. And proof that he had done it before the Heart Charity began, using the same numbers publicly. I printed the email. Then, I found an archived copy of the university's public annual summary from that year. No student information. No restricted data. Just aggregate outcomes. The retention percentage was right there. 83%. Months later, a Heart Charity brochure had used the same figure while describing our early scholarship cohort. Our. That one word carried more weight now. The number itself was public. Anyone could repeat a public number. But Sophie's later claim that the figure came from her own charity was another matter. A public statistic could not tell me who had lied. A timeline might. My phone rang while I was arranging the papers. Dad. For several seconds, the name glowed against the screen. Part of me wanted to let it go to voicemail. Another part knew I had reached the question I had been avoiding. I answered, "Hi, Dad." His voice came out brisk. "Are you working?" "Yes." "Can you talk?" "For a few minutes." He made a sound that might have been irritation. "You've always got a time limit now. That's how workdays function." Evelyn. There it was. The warning built into my name. I leaned back in my chair. What did you want to talk about? Your mother says you've been digging through old charity materials. She doesn't know what I've been reviewing. Don't get technical with me. The sentence almost made me smile. Technical was what people called facts when they wanted to move past them. Then let me ask something simple. Fine. When you asked me for the scholarship framework 8 years ago, who did you send it to? Nothing came back immediately. I could hear the faint hum of something on his end. A car vent, maybe. I don't remember. The file was called First Gen Retention Framework. So you asked for it in May. Who did you send it to? Evelyn, this was 8 years ago. I know. You cannot expect me to remember every attachment. That's fair. I looked at the email sitting beside my hand. Do you remember whether you sent it to Sophie? A pause. Then Dad said, probably. One word. Probably. Nuatrage. No confusion. No demand to know why I would think such a thing. Just probably. My fingertips went numb around the pen. Why? She wanted to start somewhere. Did you tell her it came from my university project? Oh, for God's sake. That's a yes or no question. It was for the family, Evelyn. My breath caught, not because he had raised his voice. Because he hadn't. The words came out with the casual confidence of someone explaining why a serving dish belonged in the kitchen. It wasn't yours, I said. I didn't say it was mine. You gave it to someone else. You gave it to me. As a sample. And Sophie needed a sample. I looked across my office at the bookshelves. The room suddenly felt sharper around the edges. You could have asked me. Why would I need permission to help your sister with a charitable project? Because it was work I developed through my job. Dad hid. This is what I mean. You turn everything into ownership and permissions and procedures. I work in compliance. No, you hide behind compliance. My jaw tightened. How? You make simple things technical so nobody can tell you you're overreacting. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then something in me settled. Maybe because there was finally nothing left to explain. The issue was not that Dad had forgotten to credit me. He had never believed the decision belonged to me. My work had entered his hands, and in his mind that had made it available for redistribution. Not stolen. Not borrowed. Allocated. Like I was another family account he managed. When Sophie used those materials, I asked, did you tell her they were mine? Dad's answer came fast. She knew you helped. Helped. There it was again. I closed my eyes. Okay. That's it? Yes. You're not going to argue? No. His tone changed. That makes me nervous. I opened my eyes. It shouldn't. Evelyn, don't send anything to that board until we've talked this through as a family. We just did. No, we didn't. We talked. I asked. You answered. That is not what I meant. I know. Then I ended the call. For several seconds, the phone stayed in my hand. A younger version of me would have called him back. I would have worried the ending sounded rude. I would have rewritten my side of the conversation until I found a version where nobody could accuse me of disrespect. Instead, I wrote one sentence on the legal pad. Richard confirms he probably sent framework to Sophie. Underneath it, I added, do not characterize as theft. Characterize as transmission and access. That distinction mattered. Especially now. Mom called 40 minutes later. Of course she did. I almost ignored it. Then I realized if she had something substantive to say, I needed to hear it once. Only once. Hi, Mom. Your father is extremely upset. I'm sure. Don't do that. Do what? Sound like this is all beneath you. It isn't beneath me. Then why are you treating us like strangers? That question had followed me through half my adult life. Every boundary became evidence of distance. Every request for clarity became proof that I did not trust them. I asked Dad where the file went, and he answered you. Yes. So what else do you want? The simplicity of that stunned me. You don't see a problem with him giving Sophie work from my university project and then letting everyone say she developed the model. Mom exhaled. It was a template. If it was only a template, why did Sophie later use the same retention figure? Numbers are numbers. And the wording? What wording? The phrasing in the donor materials. I don't know, Evelyn. I don't sit around comparing brochures from 8 years ago. Neither did I. Then stop now. The words came quietly. Not dramatic. Not angry. Just direct. Stop now. I stared at the window beside my desk. Why? Because this is hurting everyone. Who is everyone? Please don't start. I'm asking. You know exactly what I mean. No. I know Sophie is upset. Dad is upset. You're upset. And that isn't enough for you. There had been a time when it would have been. 3 unhappy people against 1 uncomfortable truth. Simple math. I rubbed my thumb across the edge of the legal pad. If I'm wrong, the records will show that. Mom went quiet. Then she said, "Your grandfather wanted this foundation to bring people together." I heard the letter too. You heard what you wanted to hear. No, I heard him ask the board to verify the origin of the program. This is exactly why people think you're difficult. A strange calm moved through me. Not numbness. Recognition. There was the price tag. Ask one question too many. And the conversation stopped being about the question. It became about me. From now on, I said, anything about the foundation needs to be in writing. What? Email or text. Why? So nobody has to remember later what was said. Mom's voice sharpened. That is insulting. It's a boundary. Don't use therapy words with me. I'm not. The irony almost made me laugh. Evelyn, I have to get back to work. You always do this. I nearly asked what this meant. Then I decided I already knew enough. Send me anything you need me to read. I ended the call. By Saturday, there were 3 missed calls from Mom, 2 from Dad, and 1 from Sophie. None were emergencies. I knew because every voicemail began with some version of "call me when you have a minute." For the first time, I decided I did not have a minute. My dining table had disappeared under binders, printouts, old Heart charity brochures, and legal pads. The sight irritated me, not because the work was difficult, because my home had started looking like an annex of the problem. So I put everything into one storage box. One. Not the kitchen counter. Not the coffee table. Not a second pile beside the couch. One box. I labeled it Heart Foundation and slid it beneath the console in my spare room. The dining table reappeared. Bare wood. A shallow ceramic bowl. The small plant I kept forgetting to water. Ordinary things. Mine. Coffee in hand, I opened my laptop. There was another document I had not touched in nearly 3 weeks. A concept note for a university grant initiative I had wanted to propose before Grandpa died. Nothing glamorous. A regional program supporting first-generation students through transitions between community colleges and 4-year institutions. The file had stalled because every evening lately had been swallowed by someone else's urgency. I opened it. At the top of the first page was a blank author field. For some reason, that bothered me. My fingers moved before I could overthink it. Prepared by Evelyn Hart. Seeing my name there felt embarrassingly good. So good I almost deleted it. That reflex made me sit back. For years, I had trained myself to soften ownership. We did. Our team. I helped. The program developed. Passive voice was useful when you wanted no one to accuse you of taking too much credit. That morning, I left my name where it was. I worked for an hour. Only an hour. Then I saved the file and closed the laptop. The world did not end because I had ignored 6 calls. Nobody lost a scholarship. No foundation collapsed. The day still belonged to me. I put on a coat and walked 3 miles along the river. By the time I came home, nothing about the board review had changed. Something about me had. Monday morning, the dossier looked different. Less like a weapon. More like a record. The distinction became important when I found an email from Sophie that I had forgotten. She had suggested a donor mentorship component several years earlier. The idea was hers. Clearly hers. She proposed matching scholarship recipients with professionals in fields they wanted to enter and building an alumni network around the program. It was a good idea. My first reaction was annoyance. That bothered me enough to stop. If I excluded the email, the timeline would become cleaner. Easier. Evelyn built the model. Sophie took it. End of story. Except, that was not the truth. Sophie had contributed something real. Maybe not the thing she claimed. But something. I added the email to the source list. Then I rewrote the summary. The available records support that the university scholarship framework and retention model predated the Hart charity materials. The records reviewed do not support a conclusion that she originated the underlying scholarship framework. I read it twice. No adjectives. No accusation. No claim of personal ownership over university work. Only chronology. Under limitations, I added. University-created materials are referenced solely to establish timing and provenance. No claim is made here regarding personal ownership of university intellectual property. That sentence cost me nothing. Emotionally, it cost me more than I expected. Because fairness had always been demanded from me by people who rarely returned it. There was a childish part of me that wanted one moment when I did not have to be the careful one. One moment when I could exaggerate too. Leave out the inconvenient fact. Make Sophie smaller so I could finally look bigger. I didn't. Not because she deserved protection. Because I needed to recognize the person on the other side of this when it was over. Tuesday afternoon, the dossier was ready. A provenance memo. A source index. Dated correspondence. Public materials. Janet's verification. Dad's request for the sample framework. His later email referencing the retention numbers. The old exchange, where I had once asked him why Sophie's brochure described the scholarship structure as something she had created. His response from years ago sat in the file like a small fossil. Don't make this about credit. The point is helping students. At the time, I had obeyed. Now it became part of the chronology. Not because it proved misconduct. Because it proved the question existed long before Grandpa's will was read. My cursor rested over the email to Dr. Cole. The attachment was ready. All I had to do was send it. The cost finally felt real. Once the board received that memo, Dad could no longer describe the issue as a misunderstanding over lunch. Mom could no longer smooth it down with a phone call. Sophie would get a chance to respond. And my name would sit at the bottom of the concern. No hiding. No whispering. No letting someone else decide whether it mattered. My stomach tightened. Then, the phrase from Saturday came back. Prepared by Evelyn Hart. The same name could sit under work I wanted, and under a decision I feared. Both belonged to me. I clicked, send. The confirmation from Miriam arrived less than an hour later. Thank you. The board will review the materials and provide Miss Sophie Hart an opportunity to respond in writing. No determination has been made. Good. That was exactly how it should work. Dad texted before dinner. You need to fix this before it gets formal. I stared at the message. It already was formal. That was the point. Mom sent another. Your sister is barely sleeping. I hope proving your point is worth this. No question about whether the records were accurate. No question about what Dad had admitted. Only the cost to Sophie. Then came Sophie's message. Weaponizing Grandpa's death to steal a position you claim you don't even want is a new low. My thumb hovered over the screen. 10 different answers came to mind. None would improve the record. So I typed only one. Submit the timeline you believe is accurate. 3 dots appeared. Disappeared. Returned. Then, Sophie replied. Gladly. That single word stayed with me all evening. Confidence had always been one of her advantages. She could tell a story as if certainty itself made it true. Maybe that worked when Mom was nodding beside her. Maybe it worked when Dad supplied the missing pieces. Maybe it worked in donor rooms where nobody had a reason to ask which version came first. A written chronology was different. Dates stayed where you put them. Claims could be compared. Sources could refuse to cooperate with the story. 2 mornings later, an email from Miriam appeared while I was reviewing a completely unrelated grant budget. I almost saved it for lunch. Almost. Then, I saw the subject. Hart Education Foundation Provenance Review. The message contained 4 sentences. The third made me sit back. Sophie has submitted a written chronology of the program's development. Several material dates directly conflict with the records you provided. The board will need to hear from both of you before determining next steps. My pulse thudded once against my throat, then slowed. For once, Sophie had done exactly what I needed her to do. She had put her story in writing. Sophie's chronology arrived the next morning. I waited until I finished the grant review already open on my screen before downloading it. That decision cost me almost 40 minutes. 3 weeks earlier, anything connected to my parents would have pushed every other responsibility aside. I would have told myself the interruption was temporary, then spent the rest of the day living inside somebody else's emergency. This time, the university file came first. Only after I submitted my review did I close it, refill my coffee, and open the document carrying my sister's name. The chronology was 6 pages long, more polished than I expected. More specific, too. That was the first thing that concerned me. Specificity could protect you when the dates were right. When they weren't, it became a cage. According to Sophie, she had conceived the scholarship model in March of that year, after a conversation with Grandpa about first-generation students. She wrote that Grandpa encouraged her to develop the concept. My involvement was described in a single sentence. My sister, Evelyn Hart, later provided limited administrative guidance based on her university experience. Limited administrative guidance. I read it twice. There was no anger at first. Just the strange sensation of watching someone erase years of work with 4 professionally chosen words. Then came her claim about the retention figure. The 83% outcome, Sophie wrote, had been generated through the Hart Charity's early scholarship cohort and later influenced refinements to the program. That one made me sit back. I took out the yellow legal pad I had been using for the review. No speeches. No adjectives. Just comparison. Sophie said March. My dated framework existed in January. Janet's review correspondence was from February. Sophie said I polished administrative language. Janet's comments had been directed to me about eligibility design, persistence criteria, and evaluation measures. Sophie said the 83% retention figure came from her charity. The same aggregate figure had appeared in the university's published annual summary before the Hart Charity described any cohort using it. Her final claim was more personal. She wrote that I had never challenged her role until after Grandpa died. For a moment, I simply stared at that sentence. Then I remembered something. Not a dramatic confrontation. An email. Years ago, after Mom sent the first Hart Charity brochure to half our extended relatives, I had written Dad privately. Why does this say Sophie developed the scholarship framework? His answer had been short enough that I remembered the rhythm before I found the words. Don't make this about credit. The point is helping students. I had obeyed. That silence had apparently become evidence against me. My fingers went still over the keyboard. For years, keeping the peace had required me to swallow objections quickly enough that later everyone could claim I had never objected at all. This time, there was a date attached. I found the exchange and added it to the comparison. 4 claims. 4 records. That was enough. Anything beyond that risked turning clarity into noise. Near the bottom of Sophie's chronology, another phrase caught my attention. Support persistence beyond initial academic performance indicators. The same clumsy wording I had noticed in the old brochure. Seeing it in a document Sophie had personally submitted was different. Still not proof of how the words traveled. But it tightened the root. The phrasing had existed in my evaluation work. Dad had seen the retention material. Sophie had received my framework from him, by his own admission. Now the phrasing appeared again in her signed chronology. Not one smoking gun. A sequence. Sequences were harder to charm. My phone buzzed beside the legal pad. A message from Mom. Please don't dissect every word Sophie wrote just to make her look bad. I looked at the chronology. Then at my notes. That was exactly the difference between us. Mom thought checking whether words were true was an act of aggression. Sophie thought writing them confidently made them safe. I opened a new document and titled it Chronology Comparison. Then I started with her words, not mine. By noon, the table contained only the strongest contradictions. I removed 2 weaker points because they relied too much on memory. Deleted another because common language and education programs could explain the similarity. When I finished, the record was shorter than when I started. Stronger too. That afternoon, I called Janet. Do you have 10 minutes? I asked. 8 if you want me useful. 8 works. I sent her only the February review correspondence. Nothing about Dad. Nothing about Mom. Nothing about Sophie's messages. Janet was not there to join my side. She was there to verify her own record. You want me to confirm this date? She asked. And whether I was the person you were reviewing the framework with. That part I can confirm. Anything else? No. Her answer came immediately. You don't remember Sophie being involved? I remember what I wrote down, Janet said. That's safer than telling you what I think I remember. A smile pulled at one corner of my mouth. Exactly. I can tell the board the same thing if they ask. Only if they ask. There was a pause. You don't want me there? I want the records to stand before anyone stands for me. Janet was quiet for a second. Then she said, all right. No praise. No promise that everything would work out. Just all right. It was exactly what I needed. After the call, I should have gone back to the chronology. Instead, I closed it. The concept note for my university grant initiative was still sitting in my drafts, prepared by Evelyn Hart. The line had survived the week. So had the strange discomfort it caused me. I opened the document. For the next hour, Sophie's chronology did not exist. Neither did Dad's text. Neither did Grandpa's foundation. I worked on something that had no heartboard, no family representative, no inheritance attached to it. The proposal was mine only in the ordinary professional sense that mattered to me. My responsibility, my thinking, my name where my contribution belonged. By late afternoon, I had finished enough to submit the concept note for internal review. My cursor rested over the button. A thought came, sharp and almost embarrassing. What if the board rejected my evidence? What if Sophie kept the nomination? What if Mom and Dad stopped speaking to me? The project on my screen would still exist. So would my job. My mortgage. My Saturday mornings. My name. I clicked submit. The confirmation appeared. For a few seconds, I just looked at it. The outcome of the foundation review had not changed. My life had moved anyway. That mattered more than I expected. The night before the board meeting, Dad called at 7:16. I let it ring once before remembering the boundary I had already set. Foundation matters in writing. The call stopped. A text appeared almost immediately. We need to resolve this tonight. I answered with one line. Please send whatever you want me to consider in writing. 5 minutes later, an email arrived. Dad had copied Mom and Sophie. The proposal was simple. Sophie would amend the chronology to acknowledge that I had contributed to the early technical development of the program. My name would appear in future historical materials. In exchange, I would tell the board that the provenance concern had been resolved privately and that I no longer objected to Sophie's confirmation. I read it twice. For years, that would have looked like victory. My name restored. Recognition. The thing I had claimed not to need, and secretly wanted anyway. Except the chronology would still call Sophie the originator. She would still keep the authority she was asking the board to grant, based partly on that history. I would receive acknowledgement. She would keep the story. Sophie called before I could answer the email. I almost let it go. Then I picked up. What? She said immediately. No hello. What about the proposal? You got it? Yes. Well, I have one question. She sighed. Of course you do. Will you correct the chronology and tell the board which parts came from the university model I developed? I said I'd acknowledge your help. That wasn't my question. You want me to walk in there and call myself a liar? No, I want you to correct the parts that aren't accurate. They're accurate from my perspective. Dates don't have perspectives. God, Evelyn. Her voice grew louder. This is what I mean. You've always hated that people listen to me. The words hurt less than they once would have. Maybe because I finally understood what I wanted from her. Not affection. Not permission. An accurate record. If you believe the chronology is accurate, I said, leave it exactly as it is. That stopped her. What? Submit it. Defend it. You're threatening me. No. Then what are you doing? Letting the board compare it. Another pause. Then Sophie said, Mom was right. You don't even care what happens to us anymore. Us. A word broad enough to carry whatever guilt was needed. I looked at Dad's email again. I care enough not to lie for you. That is unbelievably self-righteous. Maybe. You really think you're better than me? No. That answer surprised both of us enough that the line went quiet. I continued. I think the record should be accurate even where it helps you. She knew what I meant. The mentorship component was in my dossier, her contribution, her idea, preserved because it was true. Sophie's voice dropped. You're going to embarrass me. If correcting the chronology embarrasses you, I can't fix that. She hung up. A minute later, Mom texted, "Let your sister keep one thing." I read it once. Then typed, "I'm not trading accuracy for access to my own name." No one answered. The next morning, the board meeting took place in Connecticut, in a conference suite 2 floors above the law office, where the will had been read. Dad, Mom, and Sophie arrived together. I came alone. The lobby smelled faintly of coffee and furniture polish. Mom stood when I walked in. "We still have time." "For what?" "To stop this. I'm attending a scheduled review." Dad looked toward the closed conference room doors. "This didn't need to happen." "Then Sophie can correct the chronology." My sister was sitting near the windows with a leather folder on her lap. She looked up. "I'm not changing the truth because you found some ancient emails." I nodded. "Then we're done talking about it." Dad stepped closer. "Do you understand what you're doing to your sister's reputation?" A year ago, maybe even a month ago, that question would have pulled me into defending my intentions. Instead, I asked, "Is anything in my submission false?" His jaw tightened. "That's not the point. It is in that room." The conference door opened. The board secretary called Sophie's name first, then mine. Dad moved as if to follow. The secretary stopped him politely. "Only the nominee, the submitting party, and board participants are scheduled for this session." Dad frowned. "I'm their father." "Yes, sir. Nothing else." New argument. No exception. Mom looked at me as if I had arranged it. I hadn't. That distinction felt unexpectedly important. Their exclusion was not my revenge. It was simply the governance process they had spent weeks treating like an inconvenience. My phone vibrated again before I stepped through the door. "Dad, don't do this." "Mom, please remember who you're hurting." I switched the phone to Do Not Disturb. Then I walked in. Dr. Cole sat at the center of the table with 4 other board members and the secretary. No wood-paneled drama. No audience. No lawyer waiting to announce a twist. Just documents, water glasses, and people who had read the material. Miriam began. "I want to make the scope clear. We are not determining ownership of university intellectual property. We are not adjudicating a private dispute between sisters." Sophie shifted beside me. "The board is evaluating the accuracy of representations relevant to the nominee's suitability under the Foundation's bylaws." That sentence steadied me. Accuracy. Suitability. Nothing more. Sophie was invited to speak first. She described the scholarship model as collaborative. She talked about Grandpa's encouragement, her donor work, and the way ideas circulated informally among relatives. Her voice never shook. She was good at rooms. She always had been. Then she said something I had expected. "My sister contributed administrative expertise because that was her professional background." Administrative expertise. The same phrase in a softer dress. When my turn came, Miriam asked whether I wanted to make an opening statement. "No." One board member looked up. "No?" "I'd rather answer the chronology." I slid my comparison forward. "The first disputed point is the development date." No flourish. "Sophie's chronology says March. The framework draft is dated January. Janet Morales's review correspondence is from February. The secretary already had copies." The second point concerns my role. The chronology describes me as providing limited administrative guidance. The February review addressed core design questions directly with me, including eligibility and persistence measures. Sophie leaned toward her microphone. "That doesn't mean I wasn't developing my versions separately." I turned slightly toward her. "I didn't say it did." That seemed to unsettle her more than contradiction would have. A board member asked, "So what does the record establish?" "That the framework existed before the March date, and that my involvement was broader than administrative polishing." It does not establish everything Sophie was or wasn't doing separately. My own voice sounded almost too calm. "Good." The third point was the retention figure. The chronology attributes the 83% figure to the Heart Charity's early cohort. The same aggregate outcome appears in the university's published annual summary, before the charity described its cohort that way. Miriam looked at Sophie. "Can you identify the underlying Heart cohort from which that figure was calculated?" Sophie opened her folder. Pages moved. "I would need to check the older records." "Was the figure generated by the Heart Charity?" "That was my understanding." Based on what? Sophie looked down again. I don't remember 8-year-old reporting details. Nobody reacted. No gasps. No triumphant looks toward me. The absence of theater made the moment stronger. A claim had been made. A source had been requested. The source was not there. Another board member asked me about the mentorship component. Yes, I said. That was Sophie's contribution. My sister turned toward me. For the first time all morning, our eyes met. I continued. She proposed the donor mentorship structure. The email documenting it is included because it belongs in the record. The board member nodded. Even though it helps her position? It's accurate. Sophie looked away. Then we reached the final contradiction. Her claim that I had never raised an attribution concern before Grandpa's death. The secretary displayed the old email exchange. My question. Dad's response. Don't make this about credit. The point is helping students. Miriam looked at Sophie. Were you aware your sister had raised attribution before the will reading? I wasn't copied on that email. That wasn't my question. Sophie pressed her lips together. I knew she sometimes complained that people didn't appreciate her enough. My hands remained folded on the table. There it was again. Turn the record into personality. Miriam glanced down at the chronology. You wrote that no attribution concern had been raised. I meant no formal concern. That qualification does not appear here. Sophie's fingers tightened around her pen. Then she said, in our family, ideas were always shared. For a second, Dad's voice seemed to echo through the sentence. It was for the family, Evelyn. Different speaker. Same rule. Miriam asked. Then why does the chronology identify you individually as the originator? Sophie opened her mouth. Stopped. Looked at the page. Nothing about that moment felt like revenge. It felt like gravity. The story had finally been placed somewhere it could not keep changing shape. The board did not make a decision that morning. I was glad. An immediate verdict would have felt theatrical. Instead, Miriam closed the discussion by saying the chronology contained enough unresolved inconsistencies to require further review before Sophie's nomination could be confirmed. Her appointment remained pending. The board would evaluate the accuracy of the submission, disclosure issues, and suitability under the existing bylaws. That was all. Outside the conference room, Mom and Dad stood as soon as we appeared. Sophie walked past them toward the elevators. Mom started after her, then turned to me. What happened? The board is continuing the review. Dad's face hardened. You could have stopped that. Yes. The word came out before the old instinct could dress it up. His eyebrows lifted. I held his gaze. I could have accepted the private correction. I didn't. Mom stared at me. Why? Because the chronology would still be false. Sophie offered to put your name in. My name wasn't the only problem. Dad stepped closer. You have no idea what you've set in motion. For once, I did. Not the outcome. Not what Sophie would do next. Not whether the board would remove her nomination, but I knew what I had done. I had stopped accepting acknowledgement as a substitute for accuracy. I have to go, I said. Dad laughed without humor. Of course you do. The elevator doors opened. My phone came back to life when I switched off Do Not Disturb. 9 messages. Most from my parents. 1 from Sophie. I did not read them until I was on the train north. The first few were predictable. Mom, asking me to call. Dad saying this could still be contained. Then his final message appeared. If Sophie loses that seat, don't expect your mother and me to pretend you're still part of this family. The train moved through southern Connecticut, houses and winter trees sliding backward beyond the glass. My thumb rested over the screen. For 38 years, some version of that threat had ended the argument. Behave, or lose us. Apologize, or lose us. Help your sister, or lose us. Make yourself smaller, or lose us. This time, the message did something different. It clarified the choice. Dad's message stayed unanswered for 3 days. If Sophie loses that seat, don't expect your mother and me to pretend you're still part of this family. There had been a time when I would have read those words as a deadline. Call before dinner. Apologize before Sunday. Fix it before Mom stops speaking to you. Instead, I took the train home, put my suitcase in the bedroom, and went to work the next morning. Nothing dramatic happened. My key still opened my office. My paycheck still arrived. The concept note I had submitted before the board meeting came back with 2 pages of comments and a request to develop it further. A colleague stopped me outside the library and asked whether I could meet Thursday to discuss the regional partnership section. My life, apparently, had failed to notice that I was being threatened with exile. That realization hurt and steadied me at the same time. I had spent years believing belonging was something my parents controlled. Yet the evidence around me suggested otherwise. A desk with my name on it. A mortgage in my name. Work that continued whether Dad approved of me or not. People who asked what I thought without first checking whether Sophie had already answered. By Friday afternoon, I had almost gone an entire workday without looking at my phone when an email from Dr. Cole appeared. Heart Education Foundation Governance Review Outcome. My hands stopped above the mouse. This was the moment I had supposedly destroyed everyone for, at least according to Mom. I closed the grant budget on my screen and opened the email. The board had completed its review. The wording was careful and dry. I appreciated it. Sophie's chronology contained material inaccuracies regarding the development history of the scholarship framework and the source of certain outcome measures. Her submission did not adequately distinguish between work she personally originated, work adapted from the university model, and contributions made by others. Because the family representative position required accurate disclosure and adherence to the Foundation's governance standards, the board had decided not to confirm her nomination. For the time being, she would also hold no donor-facing authority on behalf of the Foundation. The charitable assets remained where they had always been, inside the Foundation, dedicated to education. Not a dollar came to me. Not a dollar went to Sophie. Nobody had $20 million. I read the email again. My pulse never raced. There was no rush of triumph. Mostly, there was quiet. The board had not declared me the better granddaughter. It had not declared Sophie a fraud in every part of her life. It had answered a narrower question. Could someone who had submitted a materially inaccurate account of her own qualifications be trusted with a governance role built partly on those qualifications? The answer was no. That was enough. Then came the part that surprised me. Relief. Not because Sophie had lost something. Because for once, I did not have to keep proving what had happened. The record had reached an endpoint outside the dining rooms, phone calls, and holiday tables where facts could be renamed according to who was upset. I sat back. My phone rang. Mom. Of course. I let it go to voicemail. 10 minutes later, Dad called. Same result. Then Sophie. I watched her name disappear from the screen. For once, nobody's urgency became mine automatically. At 5:30, I shut down my computer and went home. Their messages could wait until I had eaten dinner. That small decision felt almost more satisfying than the board outcome. Mom's voicemail was first. Evelyn, we need to talk. This has gone far enough. Dad's was shorter. Call me. Sophie did not leave one. I ate soup at my kitchen counter before responding. Not to the voicemails. To the written record. I sent Mom and Dad one text. I received the board's decision. I won't discuss the factual findings by phone. If you have something specific you want me to review, send it in writing. Dad replied almost immediately. You got what you wanted. I stared at the sentence, then put the phone face down. For the first time, I did not feel compelled to prove that he was wrong. 2 days later, another email arrived from the Foundation. The board had given individuals with direct knowledge of the disputed history an opportunity to submit written factual statements if they believed the findings omitted or misstated anything. That included my parents. I knew because Dad forwarded the notice to me with one line. See what you started. I almost deleted it. Then I thought about the irony. For weeks, Dad had insisted everyone knew what really happened. Mom had told me I was twisting old events. Now, they had a clean opportunity to put their version on paper. Names attached. Dates attached. Statements that could be compared with the existing record. Monday passed. Then Tuesday. Nothing. On Wednesday evening, Dad finally emailed me. I'm not getting dragged into more paperwork. This should never have become formal in the first place. I read it at my dining table, the same table that had been buried under heart binders only weeks earlier. Now there was one vase, my laptop, and a stack of notes for the university initiative. Mom called an hour later. I almost declined. Then I answered because I wanted to hear whether she had something different to say. Hi, Mom. Her voice sounded tired. I suppose you're happy. No. That seemed to throw her. Well, Sophie certainly isn't. I'm sure she isn't. You have an answer for everything now. No. I have answers for the things I know. Mom exhaled. The board invited your father and me to submit statements. I saw. We're not doing it. Okay. Doesn't that tell you anything? Yes. Silence. What? That you don't want your names attached to a version the board can check. The line went so quiet I could hear the refrigerator behind me. That is not fair. Then tell me what I got wrong. We don't want this dragged out. The review is already over. You know what I mean. I did. She wanted the emotional argument to continue while the factual one disappeared. That arrangement had worked for years. I had no interest in renewing it. Mom, if you have evidence the board got something wrong, send it. You sound like a machine. No. I sound like someone who doesn't want to argue about dates anymore. Her voice dropped. Couldn't you have let your sister keep one thing? There it was. Not. Was the chronology accurate? Not. Did your father have the right to give away your work? Not. Were we wrong to diminish what you did? Just one thing. As if Sophie had reached for a ribbon that happened to be lying on my side of the table. I looked at the university concept note on my laptop. It wasn't hers to keep. Mom inhaled. After everything we've done for you. No. The word came out softly. She stopped. I'm not doing that part tonight. What part? The part where we stop talking about what happened and start listing everything I owe you. You're our daughter. Yes. And that should mean something. It does. My fingers rested beside the keyboard. It just doesn't mean you get to rewrite me. Mom did not answer. Neither did I. After a few seconds, she said, I don't know who you are anymore. The sentence hurt. Less than I expected. Maybe because, for the first time, I had an answer. I'm figuring that out. Then I ended the call. Sophie waited another week. Her message arrived on a Sunday morning. Can we meet? No accusation. No capital letters. Just 4 words. I considered saying no. Then agreed to coffee in a public place halfway between us. Not because I owed her closure. Because there was one boundary I wanted to establish directly. She arrived first. No foundation folder this time. No logo. Just Sophie in a gray sweater with both hands around a paper cup. I took the chair opposite her. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then she said, You won. The old me would have denied it immediately. I would have rushed to make her feel less defeated. Instead, I asked, What did I win? My seat. I didn't get your seat. You know what I mean. I actually don't. Her mouth tightened. The board chose you over me. No, they reviewed the chronology you submitted. That's such a technical answer. It's the accurate one. She looked toward the window. You always do that. Do what? Hide inside wording. I almost smiled. Dad had said nearly the same thing. Maybe accuracy looked like hiding when you were used to being allowed to move the walls. Sophie turned back. The foundation still needs someone who understands all this. Yes. And everyone knows that's you. There was something almost familiar about the sentence. Not admiration. Need. The difference had taken me 38 years to learn. You should hire someone qualified. You are qualified. Yes. Then help. There it was. Again. Not a contract. Not a role. Not authority. Help. Who am I helping? I asked. The foundation. Or you? She looked offended. Why does everything have to be a trap with you? It doesn't. Grandpa wanted this to work. I know. And you're really going to walk away because you're angry with me. The question reached for the oldest lever available. If something good failed, it would be because I had withheld myself. I wrapped both hands around my coffee. If the foundation depends on me doing invisible work for you, then it isn't ready to operate. That's not what I'm asking. It's exactly what you asked before the review. She shook her head. You're impossible. Maybe. That's all you have to say. No. I looked at her. I won't do work through you. I won't prepare policies for you to present as yours. I won't advise you privately about decisions you don't have authority to make. If the board wants professional support, They can ask me directly and treat it like professional work. Her eyes narrowed. So you are going to work for them? I haven't decided. Of course you haven't. She gave a short laugh. You get to act like none of this mattered to you now. It mattered. Then stop pretending you didn't want to beat me. The accusation landed differently than she probably expected. There had been moments when I wanted her humiliated. Moments when seeing her smile disappear at the will reading felt good. Moments when I imagined what it would be like for everyone who had praised her to finally realize how much of the structure beneath her had been mine. Pretending otherwise would make me dishonest too. So I said. Sometimes I did. Sophie blinked. But that wasn't why I sent the record. You expect me to believe that? No. She stared at me. For once, I did not need the conversation to end with agreement. Sophie leaned back. You ruined everything Grandpa wanted. No. You got me removed. You submitted a chronology you couldn't support. Her face hardened. You're still doing it. What? Making me sound stupid. I'm not. Then, what do you call this? I held her gaze. This was never the thing I was trying to win. She looked away. Our coffee cooled between us. No reconciliation arrived. No apology. No sudden understanding. Eventually, Sophie stood. Mom thinks you'll come around. I know. You won't? Not to the way things were. She picked up her coat. For a second, I thought she might say something else. She didn't. Neither did I. That was enough. 3 days later, Miriam asked if I could speak with the board. This time, the invitation had nothing to do with Sophie. The foundation needed temporary compliance support, while it built a permanent administrative structure. A professional firm was one option. So was a short-term engagement with me, if I was interested, and if my university approved any outside work requirements. Then Miriam asked the question I had spent years wishing my relatives would ask. What would you need for that to work? Not, can you help us out? Not, do it for Grandpa. What would you need? I took the afternoon before answering. The permanent leadership role mentioned in the conversation was flattering. Too flattering. A few months earlier, I might have seen it as the ultimate correction. Sophie wanted the seat. I could have something bigger. There was revenge available if I wanted to dress it up as success. The thought made my stomach tighten. I opened the concept note for my university initiative instead. 3 departments had agreed to explore partnership. A regional community college had requested a meeting. The project was becoming real. Did I actually want to spend the next 5 years managing Grandpa's foundation? Or did I want to prove that I could? Those were not the same question. My answer became easy after that. I declined a permanent position. For temporary support, I proposed 6 months. Written scope. Market rate compensation. Direct reporting to the independent board. Clear attribution. No relative could override a compliance decision. A fixed end date. Then I added one more sentence. If those terms do not fit the foundation's needs, I completely understand and will decline the engagement. No bluff. No guilt. No need to be indispensable. The board accepted. For 6 months, I helped build something clean enough that it would no longer need a heart daughter quietly holding it together. Then I left when the contract said I would. Dad called twice during that period. Mom sent occasional message. I answered when I wanted to and only when the conversation stayed respectful. When it didn't, I ended it. There was no dramatic announcement that I was going low contact. I simply stopped making myself endlessly available. The distance created grief. Real grief. Some mornings, I still reached for my phone when something happened at work, because part of me wanted to tell Mom first. Sometimes I remembered Grandpa and wished I had known, before he died, that he had begun questioning the story everyone told about Sophie's program. There were conversations we would never have. That loss did not disappear because I had been right. One afternoon near the end of my consulting contract, I met Janet for coffee. She listened, while I told her the foundation had hired permanent staff. When I finished, she asked, "So, what are you doing next?" Not what is Sophie doing. Not what did your parents say. What are you doing? I smiled. The university initiative. The one you shelved? I unshelved it. Good. That was all. She did not tell me my relatives were monsters. She did not tell me forgiveness would heal me. She did not tell me to cut anyone off forever. She simply asked about the life I was building. I realized how rare that question had once felt. 6 months after the board decision, my foundation contract ended on a Friday. At 5 o'clock, I closed the final transition file and removed the recurring Heart Foundation meetings from my calendar. No extension. No, just until the new staff settles. The next Monday belonged to my real work again. A package from Mom was waiting outside my condo that evening. Inside was an old scrapbook from the Heart Charity. I sat on the floor and turned the pages. Sophie shaking hands with donors. Grandpa at a scholarship dinner. Mom smiling beside a banner. One page described the Heart Scholarship model Sophie developed to improve first-generation student persistence. Years ago, I would have taken out a pen, corrected the wording, added dates, maybe written my name in a margin nobody would read. This time, I closed the scrapbook. The past did not need one more annotation from me. I put it in the storage box beneath the console and shut the lid. Then I went to my dining table. No binders. No donor brochures. No emergency someone else expected me to solve. My laptop woke beneath my hands. The university initiative had reached its next stage. A full proposal waited for final submission. At the top of the first page were 4 words I once would have softened, shared, or removed. Prepared by Evelyn Hart. For a moment, I looked at my name. Not because it made me more important than Sophie. Not because Grandpa had finally chosen the right granddaughter. Not because a board had validated me. It was simply mine. My work. My responsibility. My future. I pressed submit.